Thank you, Alan. What we're going to do now is provide the last block of time to the audience to either respond to any of the previous three speakers or to make additional comments that you think rise to the level of being considered in the closing part of this meeting. But before I do that, I wanted to give an opportunity to Tom to have any remarks based on what's happened so far. Unless you want to wait a little bit later, that would be fine too.
Well, I'm happy to do it now because maybe actually
people can respond
later
to
would be fine too.
Yeah.
Someone brought up a week or two ago, I think Lou and I were at with Andreas at a World Bank meeting, and there was a meeting on international regulatory harmonization, and we had somebody there from civil aviation, person at World Bank that does civil aviation. And I raise this because this came up in Raymond's talk as well, citing this as an example. And the model that they put forward there was they had a treaty to start. That treaty gave rise then to ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which came together because there was an economic incentive for the large companies that each had their airlines to allow each other to fly to one another and to broaden their markets. And the World Bank supported that with capacity building from its outset. So the lesser developing countries, the World Bank has been working with them from the beginning. And the other element that makes this work is that there is spectacular liability on the airlines if those standards aren't maintained. So they can't get financing without it. It's a problem. There's lots that's interesting about this example in terms of making the business case for regulatory harmonization or standards harmonization, incentives and resources. But my point being here is I think to tie back to Vincent's comment is that I think what it really reveals more is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all model here. To refer to Hans George's comments, I think the opportunity cost is a great way to look at this. But those opportunity costs are borne by different parties. So there's the opportunity costs that the regulators bear, there's the opportunity costs that the businesses bear, there are opportunity costs that the consumers or patients bear. And obviously in a circumstance where regulatory harmonization is justified by those opportunity costs in all three populations, then you have this an opportunity to move forward with a particular model. To tie to Joan's comment about doing a landscape of initiatives that work, I think it's really more case studies of initiatives and why they've worked. Because there are a few initiatives that work, but they've tended to work in different circumstances. So I am a big fan, and I think Hans George referenced this also, to the joint review models that have existed in that they pool capacity, they maintain sovereignty, you have convergence of approach, but where they have worked, they've worked with developed regulators when they have a new problem that they can't tackle on their own, they have a work sharing issue they can't tackle on their own, or with least developed regulators who really don't have very much to begin with, and pooling capacity is just a sensible idea in that case. It will not work for a variety of the other countries and a variety of the other regulatory problems that we've described. In those examples, the model that APEC is pursuing might make sense in terms of encouraging people to adopt international standards, or what ICH is doing might make sense to address that particular regulatory problem. So I'd love to see us disaggregate this. Trying to come up with a uniform theory of international regulatory harmonization, I think, is an impossibility. And we also need to recognize there are going to be some areas where those opportunity costs will never line up, like the metric system for the US. That in some instances, which I'd love to see it happen, in terms of the entities that bear those costs, it hasn't lined up in a way that has been worth it, obviously, because it hasn't happened, despite some incentive to do that in a powerful National Academy of Sciences report in 1863. All this tying to, I think, fundamentally back to Peter's point and Deb's point about the Nike mentality of just doing it. I think there is something to be said about pilots and starting on a small scale, looking at what has worked where, focusing on those sweet spots where the opportunity costs from the relative entities do line up and start building that trust. I think that can definitely be done in parallel of building a international secretariat and a landscaping of legislation and the variety of other things that do need to happen. But I think it's really important that this start to develop returns. One of the things that I find daunting when you hear this conversation is all the upfront labor required by the regulators before you start reaping any benefits of the harmonization. I think is just not sustainable. So I think it needs to be done in parallel. But these are really actually not my ideas. These are all the ideas that I've heard in the audience today. So I think there's a lot to be said from what has been coming out, potentially leading to a model. Anyways, that's what I wanted.
Thank you, Tom. Very, very lucid concluding remarks. Other questions, responses to what you've heard from our last four speakers, really?